It was late October when I first heard of the killings. The air was thick with the damp scent of fallen leaves and decay, the kind that clings to your clothes and spirit alike. I was nursing the dregs of a bitter black coffee in a diner just off Route 51 when my phone buzzed, its vibrations sharp against the silence of the late hour. It was the kind of call I'd come to expect: mysterious deaths, unexplained phenomena, horrors that logic refused to reconcile. Detective Elric Graves. The voice on the other end was that of Sheriff Martha Evans of Dublin Hollow, a small town buried somewhere in the Midwest that even Google Maps would strain to locate. She had the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with the unexpected, but with just enough crack in her tone to suggest this was something altogether different. "We've had a situation," she said carefully, as though testing the words on her tongue. 10 dead. All within the past week. And Elric, it ain't natural." Her pause stretched long enough for me to hear the faint hum of wind on her end. I glanced out the diner window at the hazy moon. "Tell me. It's not just the way they died. It's how we found them." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Their heads were gone." I froze, a cold weight pressing into my gut. Gone. Clean off. And no sign of where they went. I exhaled, the kind of long, weary breath you take when the universe decides to throw you into yet another pit of darkness. Headless bodies weren't unheard of in folklore, especially not in the stories passed down from the old world, legends of creatures that hunted with no face, of headless horsemen that heralded death itself. But that was legend. This was real life, or as close to it as my world ever got. "I'll be there by morning," I said, already sliding cash onto the counter and rising to leave. The drive into Dublin Hollow was surreal, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Mist coiled along the narrow roads, swallowing my headlights whole as my old car rattled its complaints. This wasn't just small-town rural, it was forgotten. Dublin Hollow felt like a place time had abandoned, its woods gnarled and towering, its streets silent. The sheriff's office was a modest building at the edge of town. The sign creaked as I pulled in, the words, "Dublin Hollow Sheriff's Department," barely visible beneath peeling paint. Sheriff Evans was waiting for me on the porch, a tall, wiry woman with a hard face and sharper eyes. She nodded as I stepped out of my car, her gaze lingering a moment longer than was polite. "Graves?" "In the flesh," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. "I appreciate you coming so quick," she said, ushering me inside. "But I'm warning you now, it's worse than you're imagining." The inside of the office was lit by a harsh fluorescent glare. On the back wall, a corkboard displayed grainy black and white photos of each of the 10 victims. My eyes moved over them one by one, men and women, all ages, no commonalities. But the photos of the bodies, they made my stomach turn. "You said their heads were missing," I said, eyeing the images. "Were there any signs of a struggle? Blood?" "That's just it," Evans replied, crossing her arms. "There's no blood. No drag marks. Like the heads just vanished." I frowned, leaning closer. In each image, the victims' necks were smooth, almost surgically clean, no tearing, no ragged edges. It wasn't the work of an axe or blade, whatever had taken those heads had done so with an unnatural precision. "Time of death?" I asked. "Always between midnight and 2 a.m., she said, almost reluctantly. "People say they hear something when it happens. Like hooves on the road, faint as a heartbeat." "Hooves?" She nodded, her face pale beneath the harsh light. "They're calling it the Headless Horseman, like from that old story." My mind flashed to the legends of the Dullahan, the headless rider who brought death to all it encountered. I'd heard of it during my time in Ireland, whispered in pubs or carved into crumbling stone tablets. The Dullahan rode a black steed, wielded a whip made from a human spine, and carried its own head beneath its arm. Wherever it stopped riding, someone would die. But this wasn't Ireland. This was the Midwest. It's just folk talk, Evan said, shaking herself out of her own dread. But the bodies? Those are real. What about locations? I asked. Where were the victims found? She gestured toward a map pinned up next to the photos. Each red pin marked a death, and I could see a clear pattern. Each location formed a rough circle around the outskirts of Dullahan Hollow. The center of the circle? A dense forest that loomed just beyond the town. That's Blackbriar Woods, Evan said, her voice low. No one goes in there, Elric. Not anymore. Anymore? She looked at me with tired eyes. There are stories. Things people saw years ago, shadows in the trees, figures that didn't belong. We lost 2 kids in there a decade back. Never found a trace. And now? I asked, glancing back at the victims' photos. Now something's come back. I checked into the only motel Dullahan Hollow had to offer, a rundown place where the paint peeled and the walls whispered secrets in the wind. I set my duffel bag on the bed, its contents rattling faintly, charms, silver rounds, salt, and the little black notebook where I scribbled rites and rituals. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited. Midnight came and went, my revolver resting on the windowsill, its silver bullets lined neatly beside it. My fingers traced the edge of an old charm, a small iron coin etched with runes I'd come to trust over the years. And then I heard it. A faint sound in the distance, rhythmic and haunting. Hooves. I shot upright, my pulse thundering. The sound grew louder, though no light or figure appeared on the empty road outside my window. It was as if the rider moved through the mist itself, unseen but undeniable. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. When the hoofbeats stopped, a dreadful quiet settled over Dullahan Hollow, as though the world itself dared not make a sound. I kept my hand steady on my revolver, waiting for something to emerge from the mist, anything, but the road outside my window remained empty. Moments like these were the worst. The silence crawled into your bones, made you question what you knew to be real. I had seen enough to understand that the unnatural didn't always follow rules. I grabbed my coat and the duffel, slinging it over my shoulder as I stepped into the night. The air was colder now, sharp and metallic. I walked through the parking lot toward my car, every step deliberate and careful, my ears straining for any sound. Graves, a voice called from behind me, sudden and sharp. I spun around, hand on my revolver. Sheriff Evans stood at the edge of the mist, her face pale under the flickering motel lights. You heard it, didn't you? She asked, her voice low. Hooves, I replied. And then nothing. She nodded, swallowing hard. Come with me. We drove in silence through the winding roads of Dullahan Hollow, the cruiser's headlights slicing through the fog. Sheriff Evans spoke only when we passed the rusted gates leading to Blackbriar Woods. Another death tonight, she said grimly. Where? Old farmstead just south of the woods. Family of 3. Neighbors called us when they saw the lights still on at 3 a.m. That's when we found the bodies. I exhaled through my nose, already knowing what I'd see. When we pulled up to the farmstead, the scene was exactly as I imagined. The sheriff's deputies moved silently, heads low, their breath visible in the frigid air. The house was dark except for a single oil lamp burning in the kitchen window. Sheriff Evans led me inside. The farmhouse had the eerie stillness of a place abandoned mid-breath. Chairs were overturned, dishes smashed, but there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no weapons, no footsteps. In the center of the living room, the 3 bodies lay side by side. A man, a woman, and a small girl, all headless. They were found like this? I asked, crouching near the child's small shoes. She nodded. Same as the others. No blood, no sign of the heads. I studied the neck wounds, clean, surgical precision, as though the heads had simply been removed. This wasn't human. This wasn't even animal. You smell that? I said, glancing at Sheriff Evans. She frowned and inhaled deeply. Beneath the faint scent of wood smoke and old pine, there was something else, something rotten. It's faint, she whispered. Like decay, I finished. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't belong in this world. Sheriff Evans crossed her arms, steeling herself. You said something earlier about folklore. You think this has to do with the Dullahan? I don't think, I said, standing. I know. By the time dawn broke, the mist hadn't lifted. Sheriff Evans and I stood on the edge of the woods, staring into the blackened tangle of trees that marked Blackbriar's border. This thing's using the woods, I said, my gaze fixed on the dark. The deaths form a pattern around them. If it's the Dullahan, it doesn't just kill. It hunts. Sheriff Evans shifted uneasily. I've got good men who won't even step in there, Graves. Whatever's in those trees, it's older than this town. I don't blame them, I said. But I have no choice. Evans looked at me long and hard. I'll come with you. No, I said firmly, turning toward the car. This isn't a fight you're ready for. And you are. I opened the trunk and pulled out my duffel. Inside were the tools I'd come to trust over the years, a silver revolver, iron charms, salt, chalk, and a lantern lined with symbols of protection. Ready or not, I said, someone's got to step into the dark. I entered Blackbriar Woods alone. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold. It was colder, thicker, as though the forest didn't want me there. Each step crunched loudly in the brittle leaves, echoing unnaturally against the silence. I had walked cursed ground before, in forgotten places where history had twisted into something grotesque. But Blackbriar was worse. The trees loomed high and skeletal, their branches gnarled like clutching hands. The path beneath me wound aimlessly, looping back on itself in ways that defied logic. And then I saw it. A figure moved through the fog just ahead, obscured but unmistakably there. It was tall and hunched, its outline jagged and wrong, as though the very air recoiled from it. I stopped, my breath sharp. Show yourself, I said, my voice steady despite the chill gnawing at my resolve. The figure stopped too. For a long moment, the woods were still. And then, faintly, I heard the rhythmic thud of hooves. The mist thickened, swirling around me like a living thing. My hand tightened on the revolver as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer. I could feel it before I could see it, the oppressive weight of something unnatural pressing against my chest. And then it emerged. The horse was massive, black as ink, its eyes burning like coals. It moved with a silence that made my skin crawl, its hooves leaving no mark on the forest floor. And upon its back sat the rider. It was headless, just as the legends had described. A dark cloak billowed around its form, and where its head should have been, it carried something beneath its arm, a skull. No. Not a skull. A human head. The face frozen in a look of sheer terror. God help me, I whispered. The Dullahan turned toward me, and though it had no face of its own, I felt its gaze burn into me. It raised its free hand, revealing the whip in its grasp, a long, twisting thing made from what could only be described as human spine. The horse snorted, steam rising from its nostrils, and then the Dullahan moved. It charged. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but when the Dullahan charged, primal instinct screamed louder than any logic. My boots pounded against the forest floor as I bolted back through the trees, their skeletal branches clawing at my coat like hands desperate to pull me down. The sound of hoofbeats, rhythmic, relentless, grew louder with every step. I dared a glance back. The rider was close, unervingly so. Its head, no, the severed head it carried, stared at me with hollow, lifeless eyes and an expression frozen in terror. The horse's hooves struck the ground without sound, and the rider's cloak billowed like smoke behind it. Worse still was the whip, a grotesque lash of bone and sinew that cracked through the air with an ear-splitting sound. Ahead, the path twisted. My brain raced for options as I sprinted through the gloom, but the forest itself seemed to conspire against me. Roots snaked underfoot. The fog thickened, blinding me. Every turn I took led me deeper into the labyrinthine woods. And then the whip cracked again. It struck a tree just to my left with a thunderous snap, splintering wood like glass. A shockwave followed, powerful enough to send me sprawling face first into the damp leaves. "Get up," my mind hissed. "Move." I pushed off the ground, chest heaving, my revolver heavy in my grip. There was no escape now, no running faster than something like this. I turned to face the charging Dullahan, raising the gun in both hands. The creature slowed as it approached, the horse's glowing eyes locked on me. From this close, I could hear it breathe, an unnatural rasping sound that seemed to echo from deep within its hollow chest. The rider's shoulders rose and fell, its body unnaturally rigid, the whip twitching at its side like a predator preparing to strike. I fired. The gunshot exploded through the silence of the forest, ringing loud enough to set my ears buzzing. A silver bullet, one of my last, whizzed through the air and struck the Dullahan's chest. Nothing. The bullet passed through it like smoke. The rider flinched but barely paused, tilting the severed head it held as though curious, mocking me. My heart sank. "What are you?" I muttered, stepping back as the Dullahan raised the whip high above its head. Before it could strike, something shifted in the air, a sound, faint but distinct, like the distant chime of a bell. The Dullahan froze. The horse's head turned sharply, ears twitching, as though it had been summoned. For a single breath, the rider and I stood frozen in mutual stillness, the weight of its unseen gaze pressing on me like iron. Then the horse reared with a furious shriek, its hooves kicking skyward before spinning and bolting back into the fog. I stumbled to my knees, watching as the black silhouette vanished into the swirling mist. The sound of hoofbeats echoed for a long while before they, too, disappeared, leaving the woods eerily silent. I slumped back against a tree, sucking in lungfuls of freezing air, my mind racing. The Dullahan had let me live. By the time I staggered back to the edge of Blackbriar Woods, the first light of dawn had begun to bleed through the mist. Sheriff Evans was waiting near the rusted gate, her cruiser parked crookedly on the shoulder of the road. She rushed toward me as soon as I emerged, her face pale with concern. "Graves," she shouted. "Jesus, you're a mess. What happened in there?" "Your local legend's real," I panted, wiping sweat and grime from my face. "The Dullahan's here." Sheriff Evans stared at me, open-mouthed. "You saw it?" "And it saw me," I said. But something stopped it before it could finish me off. She frowned. "Stopped it?" "A sound, like a bell," I said, shaking my head. "It spooked the thing, gave me a chance to get out." Her brow furrowed, and she exchanged a glance with one of her deputies, who'd wandered closer to listen. "A bell?" "Yeah," I said, brushing leaves from my coat. "A low chime, far off but distinct." "What's in those woods, Evans?" "Something older than the Dullahan." She hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we need to keep digging. This thing's killing someone every night, Graves. If we don't stop it, we're going to lose this whole town." Later that morning, Sheriff Evans gathered a team, herself, a few trusted deputies, and me. We were going to investigate the farmstead from the previous night more thoroughly. When we returned to the scene, the sun had risen, but the farm still felt drenched in shadow. The bodies were gone, taken to the coroner's office, but the space where they had lain seemed to hum with residual energy. I walked the perimeter of the house, scanning the ground for anything the deputies might have missed. It didn't take long. Near the tree lean, I spotted something buried in the dirt, a faint, horseshoe-shaped indentation. Kneeling, I traced the mark with my gloved fingers. "It came here," I said aloud, motioning for Evans to join me. The Dullahan. It was here long enough to leave tracks. She knelt beside me, squinting at the faint mark. You think it's coming from the woods? More than that, I said, standing. It's tethered to the woods. Something called it here, Evans. The question is, who? Her eyes narrowed. You think someone summoned this thing? I've seen stranger, I said, brushing dirt from my hands. Creatures like the Dullahan don't just appear. They need a connection, something that ties them to this world. And someone, knowingly or not, may have forged that link. Evans stood with me, her shoulders squared. Then we find whoever did this. And we end it. Careful, I said, staring back at the dark outline of Blackbriar Woods. If we're going to kill a legend, we'll need more than guns. The farmstead gave us a direction, but not the answers we needed. A creature like the Dullahan didn't just manifest from thin air, it required intent, something, or someone, drawing it across the veil into our world. I'd seen it before in cases where old folklore and human ignorance collided. Sometimes it was accidental. Sometimes it wasn't. Sheriff Evans and I returned to town, its streets quieter than before. Word of the previous night's deaths had spread quickly, and people moved like ghosts between buildings, avoiding eye contact and whispering prayers under their breath. Fear clung to Dublin Hollow like a sickness. There's someone we need to talk to, Evans said as we drove down the main road. Old man Riker. Used to be the town blacksmith before his body gave up on him. He's got one foot in this world and one in the next, if you catch my drift. He knows something. I asked, watching the fog-draped streets roll by. He knows everything about Blackbriar Woods, she said. The old stories. The curses. My father used to say Riker talked to things that shouldn't talk back. Sounds like my kind of guy, I muttered. We pulled up to a dilapidated house on the edge of town, its roof sagging under the weight of years and neglect. The windows were streaked with grime, but a faint light burned in the front room. Evans led the way, stepping up to the porch and rapping hard on the door. Riker. Open up. It's Sheriff Evans. We waited, the only sound the creaking of branches in the wind. Finally, there was movement, a shuffle of footsteps, the clink of metal. The door opened just enough to reveal an old man's face, craggy and lined like ancient leather. His eyes, though cloudy, still held a spark of something sharp and watchful. Sheriff, Riker said, his voice a gravelly rasp. What are you dragging to my doorstep this time? This is Detective Graves, Evans said, nodding toward me. He's investigating the killings. Riker's pale eyes shifted to me, narrowing. You stirred it up, didn't you? I didn't stir anything, I replied, matching his gaze. I'm trying to put it back where it belongs. Riker stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before stepping back and pulling the door open wider. Come in, then. But you ain't gonna like what you hear. Inside, Riker's house was a mess of relics and memories. Tools hung from the walls, blacksmithing hammers, rusted saws, twisted iron, alongside shelves filled with yellowed books and jars of substances I couldn't name. The place smelled of soot and something older, like the air hadn't been refreshed in decades. Sit, Riker grunted, lowering himself into an ancient armchair by the fireplace. He poked at the flames with an iron poker, watching the embers dance. You're here about the rider. The Dullahan, I said. Riker flinched at the name, though his face stayed impassive. Don't call it that, he said sharply. Names have power. You know that. I nodded, letting him continue. It's older than this town, he said finally. Older than anything we've written down. When the settlers first came here, they thought Blackbriar Woods was cursed. They were right. There's something in those trees, something that don't take kindly to trespassers. My granddad called it the Hollow Rider. And the heads? Evans asked. Riker's eyes flicked to her. The rider's got no head of its own, so it takes others. They say it sees through the faces it steals, hunting anyone who's crossed its path. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. How do we stop it? Riker chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You don't stop it, boy. You survive it. That's the best you can hope for. That's not good enough, I said, my temper flaring. Someone summoned it, Riker. I need to know how to send it back. The old man stared into the fire for a long moment, his face carved from shadow. Then he rose from his chair with a groan and shuffled to one of the shelves. He returned holding a small iron medallion, its surface etched with strange, interlocking symbols. This is a ward, he said, pressing it into my hand. Wrought iron, blessed by rites older than any church. It won't stop the rider, but it'll keep it at bay long enough for you to do what needs doing. What does need doing? Evans asked warily. Riker's gaze shifted to me. You've got to find its anchor, the thing that called it here. The rider's tethered to something hidden in those woods. A token. An offering. Destroy it, and you might just send the rider back to whatever hell it came from. And if we don't? I asked. Riker's eyes were cold. Then it won't stop hunting. Not until it's taken every last head in Dublin Hollow. The sun was setting by the time we reached the edge of Blackbriar Woods again. Sheriff Evans and I stood by her cruiser, the last light of day bleeding red across the horizon. She loaded her shotgun, her hands steady but her face pale. You don't have to come with me, I said, checking the revolver's silver rounds for the third time. I'm not letting you walk into those woods alone, Graves, she replied. If this thing's hunting my town, I'm going to help end it. I nodded, tucking Riker's iron ward into my coat pocket. Fair enough. Just remember, this isn't a man we're hunting. It's a legend. Evans met my gaze, her jaw set. Then we'll kill a legend. We entered the woods in silence, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the gloom. The trees seemed closer now, their shadows reaching long and crooked across the forest floor. I could feel it again, that oppressive weight in the air, as though the forest itself was watching us. It's too quiet, Evans whispered, her voice barely audible. Good, I said. That means it knows we're here. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of Blackbriar. I followed the marks, the faint, clawed gouges on trees, the traces of hooves pressed into the earth. The Dullahan had passed this way, moving toward something. And then we heard it. A distant sound, soft at first, like a bell tolling far away. Evans froze. That's the sound you heard last night? Yeah, I said, my hand tightening on the revolver. It's calling it back. Calling it where? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because up ahead, the forest opened into a clearing, and at its center stood something I'd hoped not to see. A stone altar. The thing was ancient, cracked and covered in moss, its surface etched with the same symbols I'd seen on Riker's ward. Resting atop it was a severed head, its face frozen in terror. Blood pooled around the stone, though it looked old, as though it had been soaking into the earth for years. Evans gagged beside me. Oh my God. It's the anchor, I said grimly. This is what summoned the rider. From the fog behind us came the sound of hooves. The Dullahan was here. The hooves came louder now, relentless, thunderous, each beat pounding deep into the marrow of my bones. Sheriff Evans and I turned toward the sound, our flashlights catching glimpses of mist swirling like smoke between the blackened trees. My hand tightened on the revolver, Riker's iron ward digging into my coat pocket. Graves, Evans whispered, her voice barely audible over the encroaching thunder of hooves. We can't fight that thing. We don't have to fight it, I muttered, my gaze locked on the stone altar. We just have to destroy the anchor. The air shifted. The temperature plummeted, frost blooming on the grass at our feet. The mist grew thicker, choking out the light of our flashlights. From somewhere in the shadows, I heard the slow, deliberate creak of leather and bone, the sound of something moving. And then it emerged. The horse appeared first, black as pitch, its hooves silent as they struck the earth. Mist swirled around its legs as it stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes locked on us. Upon its back sat the Dullahan, cloaked in tattered black, its body unnaturally rigid. Its head, no, the severed head it carried, rested in its gauntlet hand, its hollow eyes burning faintly with an otherworldly light. The rider tilted the head slightly, as though it was looking at us. My blood ran cold. "Stay behind me," I muttered to Evans, raising the revolver and pointing it at the altar. "If we break the anchor, it loses its tether." The Dullahan shifted, its skeletal form pulling the whip of human spine from its belt. With a flick of its wrist, the whip cracked through the air with a noise like a gunshot, splitting the fog and making the earth tremble. I stepped closer to the altar, the iron ward warm against my chest, as though humming with power. "Cover me!" I shouted to Evans. She didn't hesitate. She raised her shotgun, the sound of the first blast roaring through the clearing like thunder. The pellet struck the rider, passing harmlessly through it like smoke, but the effort bought me time. I reached the altar, the severed head atop it staring lifelessly at me, its mouth frozen mid-scream. "This is where it's tied," I whispered, pulling a silver knife from my belt. "You're not staying here, you bastard." With a grunt, I raised the blade and slammed it down onto the severed head. The reaction was immediate. The earth trembled, and the clearing erupted with sound, a chorus of screams, hooves pounding, and wind howling as though the forest itself was in agony. The Dullahan shrieked, its headless body rearing back on the horse as the severed head beneath my knife crumbled into ash. The mist swirled violently, collapsing in on itself. The Dullahan turned its gaze, what little it had, toward me. For a moment, I thought it might strike, even without its anchor. But then it raised its whip, cracked it once in the air, and reared the horse with an ear-piercing wail. The Dullahan faded. Its black cloak dissolved into the mist, the horse vanishing beneath it, the air finally still. Silence fell. Evans was beside me now, her breathing ragged, her shotgun still clutched in her shaking hands. Is it gone?" I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the tension leave my body. "For now," I said, looking at the ash scattered across the altar. "The anchor's destroyed. It's been banished." Evans let out a hollow laugh, her relief tempered by the realization of what we just faced. "You mean to tell me we just sent a headless horseman back to wherever it crawled out of?" "Something like that," I muttered, staring into the darkened woods. "Let's just hope it doesn't find its way back." By dawn, Black Briar Woods seemed different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight of the Dullahan's presence gone. Sheriff Evans and I returned to Dublin Hollow, our steps slow and quiet, our nerves still frayed from the night before. The townspeople gathered when we emerged from the woods, their faces pale but expectant. Word had spread. "It's over," Evans said, addressing the small crowd. "Whatever was out there, it's gone." The murmurs were cautious, but I could see a glimmer of relief in their eyes. The fog that had suffocated the town for weeks began to lift, and the faint warmth of the sun finally broke through the clouds. Old man Riker was waiting near the sheriff's office when we returned. He leaned heavily on his cane, his sharp eyes studying me as I climbed out of Evans' cruiser. "You did it, didn't you?" he rasped. "It won't be coming back any time soon," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Legends had a way of lingering. Riker nodded slowly, as though he understood what I wasn't saying. "Folk like you, Graves, you don't get to rest easy. Something else will come knocking soon enough." He wasn't wrong. I'd been hunting shadows long enough to know that evil never really dies. It just waits. Sheriff Evans stepped beside me, her face lined with exhaustion but her shoulders squared. "What do we tell the people?" "Tell them the truth," I said. "The killings are over. The rider's gone. They're safe. And you? She asked. What happens to you now? I glanced out toward Blackbriar Woods, their twisted branches silhouetted against the rising sun. I'll keep moving, I said quietly. There's always something else out there. Another shadow. Another story. Evans nodded, extending her hand. For what it's worth, Graves, I'm glad you showed up when you did. I shook her hand firmly, feeling the weight of the past few days settle into my bones. Me too, I said. Take care of this town, Sheriff. They're going to need someone like you. I left Dublin Hollow that afternoon, my old car rattling down the empty roads as I put distance between myself and the woods. The Dullahan was gone, but I couldn't shake the image of its severed head, the hollow gaze, the scream frozen on its lips. It wasn't just the killing that stayed with you, it was the knowledge that creatures like the Dullahan existed at all. Legends had roots, deep ones. And sometimes those roots broke through the surface. As I drove toward the next nameless town, the next call for help, I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I swore I heard hooves in the distance. But when I looked, there was nothing but an empty road. For now.